The morning sun blazed mercilessly over the dusty plains of West Texas, casting long shadows across the 8,000-acre expanse of Dry Creek Ranch. From his position on the front porch of the weathered farmhouse, Jake Morrison surveyed his domain. With the steely gaze that had earned him a fearsome reputation throughout Millbrook County. At 62, his face was carved from granite and leather, etched deep with lines that spoke of decades under the relentless Texas sun and the weight of difficult decisions. "Get those cattle moved to the north pasture before noon," Jake barked at his foreman, Carlos Mendoza, who had worked the ranch for 15 years but still felt his stomach knot when the old man spoke. "And make sure the fence line is secure. I don't want to lose a single head to wandering." Carlos nodded quickly, adjusting his worn cowboy hat. "Yes, sir, Mr. Morrison, right away." Jake's reputation in the small town of Cedar Falls preceded him like a thunderstorm. He was known as a man who tolerated no nonsense, showed no mercy to those who crossed him, and ruled his ranch with an iron fist. Local farmers whispered stories of how he'd foreclosed on 3 struggling ranches over the past decade, buying up their land at auction when they couldn't pay their debts. The bank president, Harold Whitman, considered Jake Morrison one of his most reliable clients, a man who always collected what was owed to him, no matter the cost to others. The truth was more complex than the stories, but Jake had never bothered to correct them. After losing his wife Martha to cancer 12 years ago, and his only son David in a car accident 3 years later, he'd retreated into himself, building walls as high and strong as the fence posts that surrounded his property. If people feared him, so be it. Fear was simpler than friendship and far less likely to leave you heartbroken. The drought had been particularly brutal this year. 3 months without significant rainfall had turned the usually green pastures into fields of brown stubble. The creek that gave the ranch its name had dwindled to a trickle, and Jake found himself hauling water from the deep well twice as often as usual. Many of the smaller ranchers in the area were already talking about selling their cattle, cutting their losses before the situation got worse. But Jake Morrison didn't cut losses. He endured. He survived. He had weathered the agricultural crisis of the 1980s, the mad cow disease scare of the 1990s, and countless droughts before this one. Dry Creek Ranch would outlast them all, just as it had outlasted his wife's illness and his son's death. "Mr. Morrison," Carlos's voice interrupted his thoughts. "There's a woman here to see you. Says it's about the Henderson place." Jake's jaw tightened. The Henderson place, a small, struggling ranch about 5 miles down the road that he'd been watching carefully for the past year. Tom Henderson had borrowed heavily to expand his operation, and with the drought hitting everyone hard, Jake knew it was only a matter of time before the bank came calling. He'd already spoken to Harold Whitman about his interest in purchasing the property when it inevitably went up for auction. "Send her up," Jake said, straightening his shoulders. The woman who approached was in her early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and worn jeans that spoke of hard work rather than fashion. Her name was Lisa Henderson, Tom's daughter, and Jake could see her father's stubborn streak in the set of her jaw and the fire in her green eyes. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious tension in her posture. "Thank you for seeing me, Ms. Henderson," Jake replied, not bothering to stand or offer her a seat. "I assume this is about your father's debts." Lisa's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "My father's been working this land for 30 years. He's a good man, an honest man. He just needs a little more time to get back on his feet." "Time doesn't pay bank notes," Jake said flatly, "and good intentions don't feed cattle." "You don't understand," Lisa pressed on, her voice rising slightly. "We're not asking for charity. We're asking for patience. The drought will break, and when it does, half the ranchers in this county will be bankrupt." Jake interrupted. "That's the reality of this business, Ms. Henderson. The strong survive, and the weak get swallowed up. Is that what you told the Garcias when you bought their ranch?" Lisa shot back, her composure finally cracking. "Or the Johnsons? How many families have you destroyed with that philosophy?" Jake's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I didn't destroy anything. I provided a service. When people can't pay their debts, someone has to step in. Would you rather the bank take everything and leave the land to rot? I'd rather you show some human decency, Lisa said, her voice shaking with emotion. My father has 5 grandchildren, Mr. Morrison. 5 little ones who love running around that ranch, who think their grandfather hung the moon. When you take that land away from him, you're not just foreclosing on a business, you're destroying a family. Jake felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he'd buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it existed. For a moment, he saw not Lisa Henderson, the desperate debtor, but a young woman fighting for her family with the same fierce determination Martha had shown during her illness. He pushed the feeling down, locked it away where it couldn't weaken. His resolve, "That's not my problem," he said, his voice like gravel. "Business is business. If your father can't make his payments, he should have thought about those grandchildren before he borrowed money he couldn't repay." Lisa stared at him for a long moment, and Jake saw something die in her eyes, not just hope, but the last vestiges of faith in human kindness. "You know what, Mr. Morrison? Everyone in this county is right about you. You are exactly the cold-hearted bastard they say you are." She turned and walked away, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. Jake watched her go, his face impassive. But inside, her words hit him like physical blows. Cold-hearted bastard. He'd been called worse, but somehow, coming from her, it stung more than it should have. As the sun climbed higher and the heat began to shimmer off the dusty ground, Jake Morrison sat alone on his porch, master of 8,000 acres and respected by no one. He told himself it was better this way, that fear and respect were more reliable than love and friendship. But for the first time in years, the silence of his empty house felt less like peace and more like punishment. The drought continued, and Jake continued to plan his expansion. But something had shifted in the conversation with Lisa Henderson. A crack had appeared in the wall he'd built around his heart, and through it, he could almost hear the echo of laughter, the sound of 5 children running through pastures that might soon belong to him. He pushed the thought away and went back to work, but the crack remained, and with each passing day, it grew a little wider. 2 weeks after Lisa Henderson's visit, Jake Morrison found himself standing at the edge of his property, watching smoke rise from the Henderson ranch in the distance. It wasn't the black smoke of disaster, just the gray wisps of a cooking fire, but it served as a constant reminder of the decision he'd made. He'd given Harold Whitman the go-ahead to accelerate the foreclosure process. By the end of the month, the Henderson place would be his. The morning air was crisp with the first hint of autumn, but the drought showed no signs of breaking. Jake's own cattle were growing thin, and he'd been forced to sell off a portion of his herd earlier than planned. Still, Dry Creek Ranch was weathering the crisis better than most. His deep pockets and careful management had prepared him for exactly this kind of hardship. "Mr. Morrison," Carlos appeared beside him, his expression troubled. "There's something you should know about the Henderson place." Jake kept his eyes on the distant smoke. "What about it?" "My cousin Rosa works at the school in Cedar Falls. She says Tom Henderson's grandchildren, they've been coming to school without lunch. Teachers have been sharing their own food with them." Jake felt his jaw tighten. "That's not my concern." "I know, sir. I just thought, well, Rosa says the youngest one, little Maria, she's only 5 years old. She asked her teacher if her grandfather was in trouble because the house doesn't have food anymore." The words hit Jake like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. "Tom Henderson's financial problems aren't my responsibility. If he can't feed his family, he should have thought about that before he borrowed against his ranch." Carlos nodded slowly, but Jake could see the disapproval in his foreman's eyes. It was a look he'd grown accustomed to over the years, the way people looked at him when they thought he wasn't watching. Fear mixed with disgust, respect tainted with resentment. "There's something else," Carlos continued carefully. "The children's mother, Lisa Henderson, she's been asking around town for work. Any kind of work. But what? But people are afraid to hire her. They don't want to cross you." Jake turned to face his foreman, seeing his own reflection in Carlos's troubled eyes. "I never told anyone not to hire her. You didn't have to, sir. Your reputation speaks for itself." The truth of it settled over Jake like a heavy blanket. His reputation, the one he'd cultivated so carefully, The one that had protected him from the pain of human connection had become a weapon that hurt innocent people. The Henderson children weren't his enemies, but they were suffering because of the fear he'd spent decades building. "Carlos," Jake said quietly, "have you ever wondered why I do this? Why I buy up failing ranches?" His foreman looked surprised by the question. I assumed it was for the money, sir." Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching a red-tailed hawk circle high above the drought-stricken pasture. "When Martha was sick, before she died, she made me promise something. She said the land was important, that it needed to be preserved, protected. She worried that if all the small ranchers failed, the big corporations would move in, turn everything into shopping malls and subdivisions, so you buy the land to protect it. I tell myself that's why," Jake admitted. "But the truth is, it's easier to be the villain than to watch good people lose everything they've worked for. When I foreclose on a ranch, I'm the bad guy. I'm the one people blame. But the alternative, watching families destroy themselves trying to hold on to something that's already gone, that's worse." Carlos studied his boss with new understanding. "But you still take their land." "Yes," Jake said simply. "I still take their land, and I still sleep at night, because I know that at least it's being cared for. At least it's not being turned into a parking lot." "What about the Henderson place? Will you care for it the same way?" Jake didn't answer immediately. He thought about Lisa Henderson's fierce green eyes, about 5 hungry children, about a little girl asking her teacher if her grandfather was in trouble. "I don't know," he said finally. "I honestly don't know." That afternoon, Jake drove into Cedar Falls for the first time in months. The small town was struggling, like so many rural communities across Texas. Half the storefronts on Main Street were empty, their windows papered with for lease signs that had been there so long they'd faded in the sun. The few businesses that remained open: Murphy's Hardware, the Cedar Falls Diner, the combination post office and general store seemed to be hanging on by sheer stubbornness. Jake parked his truck outside the diner and walked in, his boots echoing on the worn linoleum floor. The conversation stopped the moment he entered, and he felt the familiar weight of dozens of eyes on him. He'd experienced this reaction countless times over the years, but today it felt different. Today, instead of satisfaction, he felt something closer to shame. "Coffee," he said to Betty Morrison, no relation, despite the shared name, the diner's owner and primary waitress. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes that had always treated everyone with the same warmth until Jake entered the room. "Sure thing, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice professionally neutral. She poured his coffee with shaking hands, and Jake noticed she avoided eye contact. He sat at the counter, aware of the whispered conversations at the tables behind him. He caught fragments: Henderson Place, foreclosure, those poor children. The words swirled around him like smoke, and for the first time in years, Jake Morrison felt the weight of his reputation as a burden rather than a shield. "Betty," he said quietly, "tell me about the Henderson children." She looked up, surprised by the question. "What about them?" "Carlos tells me they've been coming to school hungry." Betty's expression hardened. "Since when do you care about hungry children, Mr. Morrison?" The question hung in the air between them, and Jake realized he couldn't answer it. Not honestly, not in a way that would make sense to anyone, including himself. "Since now," he said finally. Betty studied his face, searching for some sign of deception or manipulation. Whatever she saw there seemed to surprise her. "They're good kids," she said slowly. "The oldest, Miguel, he's 12. Smart as a whip, always helping his little brothers and sisters. Then there's Sophia, she's 10. And the twins, Carlos and Carmen, they're 8. And little Maria," her voice softened. "Maria's only 5, but she's got her grandfather's stubborn streak. She keeps telling everyone that her abuelo is going to fix everything, that they just need to be patient. And their mother, Lisa's been working 3 jobs trying to keep food on the table. She cleans offices at night, helps at the school during the day, and does bookkeeping for Murphy's Hardware on weekends. But it's not enough, not with Tom's medical bills and the ranch failing." Jake felt the crack in his carefully constructed wall widening. "Tom's medical bills? You didn't know?" Betty's voice carried a note of accusation. "He had a heart attack. 2 months ago. That's why he missed his payment to the bank. He was in the hospital for 3 weeks, and the medical bills, well, they're destroying what little savings the family had left. The coffee grew cold in Jake's hands as the full weight of the situation settled over him. He'd been so focused on the business side of the foreclosure that he'd never bothered to learn why Tom Henderson had missed his payments. A heart attack, medical bills, a family struggling not just with drought and debt, but with the fear of losing their patriarch. Mr. Morrison. Betty's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? Jake looked up, seeing his own reflection in the diner's mirror behind the counter. The man staring back at him was old, weathered, and utterly alone. For the first time in years, he saw himself not as others saw him, as a powerful and feared rancher, but as he truly was, a man who had let grief and fear turn him into something he'd never intended to become. No, he said quietly, I don't think I am. He left money on the counter and walked out of the diner, feeling the weight of every eye in the place. As he drove home through the dusty countryside, Jake Morrison began to understand that the drought wasn't just affecting the land, it was affecting his soul. And unlike the weather, this was a crisis he had the power to do something about. The question was whether he had the courage to try. The call came at dawn on a Tuesday morning in late October. Jake Morrison answered his phone on the second ring, his voice gruff with sleep and habit. Jake, it's Harold Whitman. I've got news about the Henderson place. Jake sat up in bed, immediately alert. What kind of news? Tom Henderson died last night. Heart attack. His daughter found him in the barn this morning. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd been expecting the foreclosure to go through, had even prepared the paperwork to purchase the property at auction. But this changed everything. Jake, you there? Yeah, I'm here. Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. What about the family? Well, that's the thing. Legally, the debt transfers to the estate, but with Tom gone, there's no way they can make the payments. We'll have to accelerate the foreclosure process. The property will be up for auction next week. Jake closed his eyes, seeing Lisa Henderson's face in his mind, the fierce determination, the desperate love for her family. Now she was a widow with 5 children and a mountain of debt that would crush what remained of her world. Harold, Jake said carefully, I want you to hold off on the foreclosure. What, Jake? You said you wanted this property. If we don't move now, some other investor might. I said hold off. There was a long pause. All right, but I can't wait forever. The bank has obligations. Give me a week. Jake hung up and sat on the edge of his bed, staring out at the sunrise painting the sky above his ranch. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of a decision that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with what kind of man he wanted to be. 2 hours later, he was standing on the front porch of the Henderson ranch house, holding his head in his hands like a schoolboy. The house was smaller than he'd expected, with faded paint and a sagging roof that spoke of years of deferred maintenance. But the flower boxes under the windows were carefully tended, and children's toys scattered across the yard gave the place a warmth that Jake's own sprawling house had never possessed. Lisa Henderson answered the door wearing a black dress that looked like it had been hastily purchased from a thrift store. Her eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but when she saw Jake, they flashed with the same fire he remembered from their first meeting. Mr. Morrison, she said, her voice cold, I suppose you're here to offer your condolences before you take our home. Actually, Jake said, I'm here to offer my help. Lisa's expression shifted from anger to confusion. Your help? May I come in? I'd like to talk to you about your father's debt. She hesitated, then stepped aside. The interior of the house was cramped but immaculately clean. Family photos covered every surface. Tom Henderson with his wife, his daughter, his grandchildren. The walls were painted in bright colors that spoke of hope and love. And Jake found himself remembering when his own house had felt like a home. The children are at school, Lisa said, gesturing for him to sit at the kitchen table. I thought it was better if they had some normalcy after yesterday. Jake nodded, understanding. I'm sorry for your loss, Ms. Henderson. Your father was a good man, was he? Lisa's voice was bitter, because according to everyone in town, he was a failure, a man who couldn't pay his debts. who was about to lose everything his family had worked for. "Your father wasn't a failure," Jake said quietly. "He was a man who loved his family and tried to make a living from the land. That's more than most people can say." Lisa stared at him, searching his face for some sign of deception. "Why are you here, Mr. Morrison? What do you want?" Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "I want to make you an offer. A real offer, not a business proposition." "What kind of offer?" "I want to buy your ranch, all of it. The land, the cattle, the equipment. But I want to sell it back to you over time, at a price you can afford. No interest, no hidden fees. Just monthly payments based on what you can realistically manage." Lisa's mouth fell open. I don't understand. Why would you do that?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, trying to find the words to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. "Because I've spent the last 12 years being exactly the kind of man people expected me to be. Cold, calculating, concerned only with profit. But your father's death, it made me realize that I've been using my reputation as an excuse to avoid feeling anything. I still don't understand." "Neither do I, completely." Jake met her eyes. "But I know that 5 children are about to lose their home, and I have the power to prevent that. Maybe that's enough." Lisa was quiet for a long time, and Jake could see her wrestling with emotions: hope, suspicion, desperate need warring with pride. "What's the catch?" she asked finally. "There's no catch. But there's a condition." "I knew it. I want to hire you to manage the ranch, full-time, with a salary and benefits. Your father knew this land better than anyone, and you've grown up here. You know what it needs. You want me to work for you. I want you to work with me, as a partner, not an employee. The goal would be to build the ranch back up, make it profitable again. And when you're ready, when you can afford it, you buy me out completely." Lisa stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dusty pasture where her father had spent his final morning. "Why now?" she asked. "Why didn't you make this offer when he was alive?" It was the question Jake had been dreading, because it forced him to confront the truth about himself. "Because I was afraid," he said simply. "Afraid of caring about people. Afraid of being disappointed. Afraid of being hurt. Your father's death made me realize that being afraid of life is no way to live. And the other ranchers, the ones whose land you've already bought, I'll make them the same offer if they're interested. Some of them might be ready to retire, happy to sell outright. Others might want to try again. Either way, I won't be the vulture circling over failed dreams anymore." Lisa turned back to face him, and Jake saw something in her expression he hadn't seen before, not just hope, but respect. "I need to think about it," she said, "and I need to talk to the children. This is their home too. Take all the time you need." "But Lisa, Ms. Henderson, I meant what I said. This isn't charity. I believe you can make this ranch successful again. I believe in you." As Jake drove home through the afternoon heat, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. He thought about Martha, about the promise he'd made to her about protecting the land. Maybe this was what she'd really meant, not just preserving the acreage, but preserving the families and communities that made the land worth protecting. The drought would end eventually. The rains would come, the grass would grow green again, and the land would recover. But the damage Jake had done to his relationships, to his community, to his own soul, that would take longer to heal. He was ready to start trying. 3 months later, Jake Morrison stood in the doorway of his farmhouse, watching 5 children run through the green pastures of what had once been the Henderson place. The winter rains had finally come, breaking the drought that had strangled the region for so long. The grass was knee-high and emerald green, the creek ran full and clear, and the sound of children's laughter echoed across the valley like a promise fulfilled. "Miguel, don't go too far," Lisa called from the porch of the ranch house, which Jake had spent the last month helping to repair. The roof no longer sagged. The paint was fresh and white, and the flower boxes overflowed with blooms that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. "See, Mama." 12-year-old Miguel called back, but he continued chasing his little sister Maria through the tall grass, both of them shrieking with delight. Jake smiled, an expression that had become more familiar on his weathered face over the past few Months, the transformation hadn't been easy. Decades of isolation and bitter defensiveness couldn't be erased overnight. But working alongside Lisa and her family, watching the ranch come back to life, had awakened something in him that he'd thought was dead forever. "The cattle are looking good," Lisa said, joining him on the porch. She'd changed too. Over the past months, the desperate edge had faded from her eyes, replaced by quiet confidence and something that looked like contentment. "Your father would be proud," Jake said, and meant it. The ranch was thriving under Lisa's management. She'd inherited Tom Henderson's instincts for the land, but she'd also brought fresh ideas and modern techniques that were already showing results. "I think he would be," Lisa agreed. "And I think he'd be surprised to see you here, playing with his grandchildren." Jake chuckled, remembering how foreign the sound of his own laughter had been just a few months ago. "I'm surprised to be here myself." The changes hadn't been limited to the Henderson place. Word had spread through the county about Jake's transformation, and 3 other families whose ranches he'd acquired had accepted his offer to buy back their land. The Garcia family had decided to retire and travel, content to sell their property outright. But the Johnsons and the Kellys had jumped at the chance to start over, and both ranches were showing signs of recovery. Mr. Jake, little Maria came running up to the porch, her pigtails flying behind her. At 5 years old, she had no memory of the fearsome reputation that had once made grown men avoid Jake Morrison's eyes. To her, he was simply the kind man who'd helped her family, who brought candy on Sundays and told stories about the old days. "What is it, Mija?" Jake asked, crouching down to her level. "Look what I found." She held up a small wildflower, its petals bright yellow against the green of the grass. "It's pretty, like Mama. It's beautiful," Jake said solemnly. "Just like you." Maria giggled and ran off to show her treasure to her twin siblings, and Jake straightened up, feeling the familiar warmth in his chest that had become associated with these children. They'd filled a hole in his life that he hadn't even realized was there. Lisa said, watching her daughter dance through the grass. "She calls you Mr. Jake now, but yesterday she asked me if you were her grandfather." Jake felt his breath catch. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about love, and the people who choose to be there for you when you need them most." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the children play while the afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of gold and amber. The silence was broken by the sound of a truck coming up the drive, and Jake recognized Carlos's pickup. "Boss," Carlos called out as he approached the porch. "I've got news from town." "What kind of news?" "The good kind, I think. The county commissioner wants to meet with you. They're talking about nominating you for the Agricultural Preservation Award." Jake's eyebrows rose. "Me, the same county commission that couldn't stand the sight of me 6 months ago?" "People change their minds when they see real change," Carlos said with a grin. "And word is, the way you've handled the ranch buybacks has folks talking. They're saying maybe there's hope for keeping family farms alive in this county after all." Lisa squeezed Jake's arm. "You should be proud. You've done something remarkable here." "We've done something remarkable," Jake corrected. "All of us together." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the children reluctantly came inside for dinner. Jake had been invited to stay, as he was most evenings now, and he found himself looking forward to the chaos of family dinner, the chatter, the laughter, the sense of belonging that had been absent from his life for so long. "Can you say grace tonight, Mr. Jake?" Sophia asked as they gathered around the table. Jake hesitated. He hadn't prayed in years, hadn't felt connected to anything beyond his own pain and isolation. But looking around the table at these faces that had become so dear to him, he felt something stir in his chest. "Dear Lord," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for this food, for this family, and for second chances. Thank you for teaching an old man that it's never too late to choose love over fear, community over isolation, and hope over despair. And thank you for showing me that the greatest harvest isn't what we take from the land, but what we give to each other. Amen, amen," the children chorused, and little Maria reached over to squeeze his hand. Later, as Jake drove home through the star-filled Texas night, he thought about the man he'd been and the man he was becoming. The transformation wasn't complete, might never be complete, but it was real. He'd learned that reputation, like drought, was temporary. What mattered was what you did when the rains came, how you chose to grow when given the chance to start over. The next morning, Jake woke not to the sound of silence and solitude, but to the distant laughter of children and the lowing of cattle in green pastures. He'd built his fearsome reputation on the idea that strength meant standing alone, that survival required shutting out the world. But he'd learned that true strength came from opening your heart, that the best way to survive was to help others thrive. As he prepared for another day of working alongside Lisa and her family, Jake Morrison smiled and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the drought that had brought them together, for the rains that had healed the land, and for the chance to discover that even the most barren heart could bloom again with the right care and attention. The feared rancher of Dry Creek Ranch was gone, replaced by a man who had learned that the greatest crop you could cultivate was compassion, and the most valuable harvest was the love of a family chosen, cherished, and carefully tended through all the seasons of life.